Tank 1 M4 Sherman. What if I told you that one of America's most famous tanks had a nickname no crew ever wanted to hear? Not from the Americans, from the Germans. They called it the Ronson, like the cigarette lighter, because according to them, it lights every time. Imagine climbing inside a 30-ton steel box, knowing that if an enemy shell punched through the armor, you might not even get the chance to escape. This is the story of why the early M4 Sherman became one of World War II's most controversial tanks, and why its own crews sometimes feared what would happen after the first hit. When the Sherman entered combat in 1942, it wasn't a bad tank. In fact, it was incredibly reliable. It rarely broke down. It was easy to repair. It was fast enough to keep up with advancing troops, and America could build them faster than almost any other nation could build tanks. But reliability means nothing if one penetrating hit turns your tank into an inferno. The Sherman's biggest weakness wasn't its engine. It wasn't even its armor. It was where the ammunition was stored. Early Shermans carried dozens of shells inside the fighting compartment, many of them stacked along the sides of the hull with limited protection. If an enemy shell penetrated the armor and struck those ammunition racks, the result could be catastrophic. 1 second, the crew was fighting. The next, the inside of the tank became an explosion of fire, flying metal fragments, and burning propellant. Survivors described ammunition cooking off in rapid succession, making escape almost impossible. That's where the nickname Tommy Cooker came from. German crews watched Shermans burn so often that they believed setting one on fire was almost guaranteed. But here's where the story gets interesting. The Sherman's reputation became bigger than reality. Modern historians have found that while early Shermans were certainly vulnerable to ammunition fires, German crews also exaggerated how often it happened. And not every Sherman burst into flames. Still, the U.S. Army knew there was a problem. So engineers came up with a simple but brilliant solution. Instead of storing ammunition high inside the hull, they moved much of it into protected compartments lower in the tank. Then, they surrounded those compartments with a mixture of water and antifreeze. This became known as wet stowage. If a shell penetrated the tank, the liquid helped prevent the ammunition from igniting. The difference was dramatic. Tests and battlefield reports showed that Shermans equipped with wet ammunition storage were far less likely to catch fire after being penetrated than earlier models. In other words, the Ronson nickname mostly belonged to the early Shermans, not the later ones. But by then, the damage to its reputation had already been done. And there was another problem. By 1944, the Sherman faced Germany's Panthers and Tigers. Its armor was thinner. Its main gun often struggled against heavy German tanks from the front. That meant Sherman crews frequently had to get dangerously close or rely on teamwork to defeat enemy armor. Every engagement became a gamble. Who fired first often decided who survived. Sherman crews knew it. Many joked that their greatest protection wasn't armor. It was having 4 other Shermans beside them. That sounds brutal, but there was truth behind it. The United States accepted higher vehicle losses because it could replace tanks faster than Germany could. From a strategic perspective, it worked. From the crew's perspective, it was terrifying. Yet despite everything, Sherman crews kept fighting. The tank served on every major front of the war. It crossed France after D-Day, it fought through the Battle of the Bulge, and eventually it rolled into Germany itself. Over 49,000 Shermans were built during World War II, making it one of the most produced tanks in history. So was the Sherman really a death trap? Early on, it could be. Poor ammunition storage gave it a deadly weakness that cost countless crews their lives. But the famous light's every time reputation wasn't the whole story. Once wet stowage was introduced, the Sherman became significantly safer, proving that one engineering change could save thousands of lives. The Sherman wasn't perfect. It wasn't the strongest. It wasn't the toughest. But it may be the greatest example of how a tank's reputation can outlive the truth. And for the men trapped inside those early models, the difference came far too late. Tank 2, Type 97 Chiha. Imagine going into battle inside a tank, knowing that even a heavy machine gun could kill you. Not another tank, not a massive anti-tank gun, but a machine gun. For thousands of Japanese tank crews during World War II, that was the reality. This is the story of the Type 97 Chiha, Japan's most widely used medium tank, and why many considered it a death trap for the men inside. When the Type 97 entered service in 1938, it wasn't a bad tank. It was designed for the war Japan was fighting in China, where enemy forces had very few tanks and little anti-tank equipment. Against lightly armed infantry, the Chiha performed well. It was reliable, mobile, and did exactly what it had been designed to do. The problem was that the war changed. When Japan began fighting the United States and its allies across the Pacific, the Type 97 suddenly found itself facing M4 Shermans, powerful anti-tank guns, bazookas, and aircraft. It was completely outmatched. Its biggest weakness was its armor. At its thickest, the Chiha had only 25 millimeters of armor. That was so thin that American 50 caliber Browning machine guns could penetrate vulnerable areas of the tank under the right conditions, especially at close range. Think about that for a second. A weapon designed primarily as a heavy machine gun could damage or even destroy a tank. Against dedicated anti-tank guns, the situation was even worse. Most shells passed straight through the armor. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, fragments of steel would ricochet around the tank, seriously injuring or killing the crew even if the shell itself didn't explode. The Chiha also had a weak main gun. While it was effective against infantry and lightly armored vehicles, it struggled badly against Allied tanks. When American Shermans entered the battlefield, Japanese crews quickly realized they had little chance in a direct fight. The Sherman's gun could destroy the Chiha from long range, while the Japanese tank often couldn't penetrate the Sherman's armor even after getting much closer. As the war continued, battles on islands like Saipan, Guam, and Okinawa showed just how outdated the Type 97 had become. Many Japanese tanks were destroyed before they could even reach American positions. Some were knocked out by tanks, others by anti-tank guns, and many were destroyed by aircraft attacking from above. In many cases, crews never had the opportunity to fire a meaningful shot. Japan tried to solve the problem by introducing the Shinhoto Chiha, an improved version equipped with a more powerful 47mm gun. It was definitely an improvement and could deal with lighter Allied vehicles more effectively. However, it still struggled against the heavily armored Sherman, and its own armor remained dangerously thin. The upgrade simply wasn't enough to change the outcome of the war. While American factories produced thousands of increasingly powerful tanks, Japan couldn't keep up. The technology gap became larger every year, and the crews inside the Chiha paid the price. The saddest part is that the weakness wasn't the men operating the tank. Japanese crews fought with determination and courage, despite knowing they were entering battle in a vehicle that stood little chance against modern Allied armor. Today, the Type 97 Chiha isn't remembered as a great battlefield success. Instead, it serves as an example of how quickly military technology can become obsolete. A tank that was effective at the beginning of the war became hopelessly outclassed just a few years later. For many of the men who fought inside it, The nickname Mobile Coffin wasn't just a joke. It reflected the harsh reality that every mission could be their last, not because they lacked courage, but because the tank protecting them simply wasn't strong enough. Number 3. T-34. The T-34 is often called one of the greatest tanks of World War II. It had revolutionary sloped armor, wide tracks that handled mud and snow better than almost any other tank, and it was produced in huge numbers. It helped the Soviet Union defeat Nazi Germany and became a legend. But there's a side of the T-34 that doesn't get talked about very often. The early versions were incredibly dangerous for the men fighting inside them. From the outside, the T-34 looked almost unstoppable. From the inside, it was a completely different story. The biggest problem was the turret. Early T-34s had a two-man turret, which meant the commander wasn't just leading the tank. He also had to aim and fire the main gun. Imagine trying to spot enemy tanks, communicate with other crews, give orders to the driver, plan your next move, and accurately fire the cannon all at the same time. It was almost impossible. While commanders in German tanks could focus entirely on the battlefield, Soviet commanders were overloaded with responsibilities. Every extra second spent aiming the gun was one less second spent watching for threats. In tank combat, those few seconds often meant the difference between surviving and being destroyed. Visibility made things even worse. The early T-34 had poor vision devices and small viewing ports. Crews struggled to see what was happening around them, especially during fast-moving battles. Enemy tanks could appear from the side before the commander even realized they were there. Many Soviet crews entered combat almost blind compared to their German opponents. Then there was the lack of a turret basket. Most modern tanks and many tanks of the time had a rotating floor attached to the turret. As the turret turned, the crew turned with it. The early T-34 didn't. The turret rotated above the hull floor, forcing crew members to constantly move their feet and equipment out of the way. If they weren't paying attention, they could be struck or trapped by the rotating turret mechanism. During the chaos of battle, this slowed reloads, reduced efficiency, and made an already cramped tank even more dangerous to operate. Speaking of cramped, space inside the T-34 was extremely limited. There was barely enough room for the crew to work. Loading shells, communicating with each other, and moving around the fighting compartment was difficult even under normal conditions. Once the battle started, the cramped interior became exhausting. Crews had to work quickly in a space that left almost no room for error. Communication was another major weakness. Many early T-34s didn't even have radios. Only command tanks were regularly equipped with them, while the rest relied on signal flags or simply followed the lead tank. If the commander was knocked out or the formation became separated, entire units could lose coordination within minutes. This made Soviet attacks far more chaotic than they needed to be. Despite all these flaws, the T-34 continued fighting because it had one enormous advantage. It was simple to build, reliable in harsh conditions, and could be produced in massive numbers. The Soviet Union accepted these design compromises because it needed thousands of tanks as quickly as possible. Eventually, many of these problems were fixed. The T-34-85, introduced in 1944, featured a larger three-man turret. The commander no longer had to act as the gunner, visibility improved, and the crew became much more effective in combat. It transformed the T-34 into a far better fighting machine. But the early crews never had those improvements. They fought inside cramped vehicles with poor visibility, overwhelming workloads, and design flaws that made every battle even more dangerous than it already was. The T-34 deserves its legendary reputation for helping win the war. But for the men inside the early models, that legend came at a very high cost. Sometimes the greatest tanks in history weren't the safest ones to fight in.